Better Buildings for Humans is powered by Advanced Glazings, makers of the Solera line of products. Solera is the leading glass glazing made specifically for architectural daylighting and with extreme insulation performance. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Better Buildings for Humans. This is the show where we talk about the impact that the built environment has on our health, our wellness, our productivity, our general well-being, of course, and our happiness in being alive. And we always talk about sustainability on the show as well, because it's just so important and so closely tied. I'm your host, Joe Menchefski, and today I have Phil Galway-Witham from Gensler in Toronto on the show. Phil's a senior associate with Gensler, and he's the resilience leader with that office, and possibly for Canada. Is that true, Phil?
Yeah,
for the country?
For our Northeast region, so multiple offices. That's right.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so this is going to be fun. We're going to talk about resilience today, and I always like to start, Phil, by having our listeners get to know you. Tell us about the road that led you to architecture and to Gensler, and then, of course, why you've chosen to do a deep dive on resilience in architecture.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. So, yeah, I'm from the UK originally, but I was lucky enough to spend most of my sort of early years living in multiple countries. So I grew up bouncing around every few years from, countries of the South Pacific, Asia, Europe, and, part of that was my family were diplomats, so you move around a lot. And so as a result, I was very lucky to, experience firsthand a plethora of different cultures and cities and languages and, ethnicities, everything. I had a real sort of global upbringing. And, when it came to figuring out what I wanted to do with my life, the cities that I'd grown up in really sort of stuck with me, and I decided to pursue a career in architecture. So, I was always drawing and making things, and there was something about the craft of building spaces and cities and having a real impact on people's lives in that way, which was attractive. So I trained in the UK, completing degrees in University of Edinburgh, University of Cambridge, with my master's being in environmental design in architecture at the University of Cambridge. And, it was there that I think my interest in urban design and architecture really sort of began to focus on the impact of buildings and spaces on people. And if you think of it at that sort of super high level, and then, as a young architect beginning to come to terms with the enormous impact that the built environment has on climate change, you add those two and two together, and you pretty quickly get to a mindset, which is, okay, you've got these skills as an architect. You care about the world, you care about people and cities, and the climate crisis is front and center as an architect. Your personal impact as an architect is vastly, outsized relative to the average individual. So I began to specialize in sustainable design in the United Kingdom, working at some of the largest firms there to work on architectural change management, helping our design teams through design questions before moving to Canada. So I moved to Canada about 6 years ago now, and I've been with Gensler ever since. And with that specialism in sustainable design and sort of that impact in cities, I joined Gensler because their impact isn't just on one building. Their impact is global. We're a firm of 6,000 individuals in 60 cities around the world. And I think, at latest count, annually, our firm touches, I think it's 1.5 billion square feet of space, be it interior, architecture, urban design. And as a result, becoming an expert in sustainability and resilience in a firm of that scale and that sort of depth means that, your impact can be really leveraged at scale. So, with all that said, I've been at Gensler for about 6 years now, and I combine this expertise in sustainable design and sort of resiliency with a background in large buildings. So think aviation, think institutional governmental building, life science buildings, where the critical operation of those buildings isn't governed just by, is the building beautiful and is it comfortable? Those are critically important, but there are actually operational parameters there which are really important. So in the lines of that, sustainability becomes even more important with the changing climate.
Yeah, okay. That's a fantastic story, Phil. I'm very jealous of your wonderful upbringing. That just sounds extraordinary. Let's go right at resilience. Let's just go right at it. I've talked about it before on the show, but, I want to hear your take on it. And I think it's important if somebody just discovered the show for the first time to really understand it. So let's define it first. Can you define it as it relates to buildings and tell us why it's so important?
Yeah. So if you think of the practice and principle of resilient design, in my mind, that has to do with the capacity of built space, be it, building, the community, the city, to be able to be resilient to changing weather patterns and adverse weather events in the light of global climate change, which is aggressively and significantly changing global weather patterns in a way that we've never seen before. And that means that buildings that are not able to withstand change in the future do not meet this need to be resilient, and that will cost communities in money, in happiness, well-being, safety, and an overall lack of value to the community. So resiliency really has to be about designing for spaces to adapt to change in the future and being able to withstand that change where they can't adapt to it.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask a question sort of backwards. I mean, we have a good understanding of the way that buildings impact the environment.
Mm-hmm.
How does climate change impact a building?
So, I think we could spend this entire podcast just talking about the different ways that buildings could be impacted by climate. But let's take a couple of examples, okay, to help illuminate that there are many levels where this can be happening. First and foremost, that's been in the news most recently are the absolutely horrendous forest fires and wildfires in Southern California, in the Palisades, where you have entire communities completely annihilated by fires which were happening in January and were happening at a scale and a breadth that did not happen in that season. That doesn't happen in isolation. That happens because of changing weather patterns, because of a prolonged drought period before, resulting in fires when you would not normally have them. So, forest fires is one where you have actual explicit damage to property and explicit damage to communities. There are other extreme heat events, which are probably more significant and happen more universally across the world. As global temperatures rise, the impact of that heat rise, that heat increase, will be felt more significantly in cities. A combination of density and the urban heat island effect, which your listeners, I'm guessing, will know, but I'll just kind of summarize it now, which is within cities, typically temperatures are between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius hotter than the suburban areas around them because of the heat radiating from the buildings and the streets back into the space. So as temperatures increase, they will increase more rapidly in cities. This will impact comfort, this will impact health, this will impact well-being, not only in the streets, which become significantly hotter and dangerous for at-risk communities, but also within the buildings. If buildings aren't properly designed to withstand higher heat days and more prolonged heat, you have instances where the comfort and the safety within those buildings is put at risk. Another example, I'll go back to the forest fires, is that even if your community isn't directly impacted by forest fires, the smoke associated with those fires can be felt provinces away here in Canada. A couple of years ago when there were terrible forest fires in Northern Ontario and Quebec, here in Toronto, downtown Toronto, we could feel it. You could feel it catch in your throat. And for the built environment, if you're not designing buildings to withstand, high concentrations of that particulate matter in terms of filters and things like that, going to struggle. So those are just three examples. Rising sea levels is another one which I think I left to the end because it's kind of more obvious. If you live in communities and low-lying coastal areas, global sea levels. Yeah, there we go, Joe. This is one which is probably one of the faces of global climate change. Coastal communities in Atlantic Canada, but also in Polynesian islands. I personally lived in a Polynesian island in the Pacific. Like, these are at risk. They might not be here in 20 years. And that's a huge impact to the cities in those countries and coastal communities as well. So the impact of global climate change on the built environment is varied, depends on locations, but it is significant and is being felt all over the world.
Manage the connection between building occupants and the outside world using Solera translucent glass. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Yeah, okay, absolutely. That's a very thorough and well-stated definition. Let's talk about some of the work that Gensler has done fairly recently. I know you guys did what did they call it? A Global Climate Action Survey.
Yeah, that's right.
What were you trying to understand?
So the Global Climate Action Survey, I think this is the second year we'd done it, and we're going to be doing this every year moving forward at Gensler, was a survey of 17,000 people from 15 different countries around the world, where we were trying to gain insight into the perceptions of various communities from various socioeconomic backgrounds to the question of climate preparedness and climate risk. So, to be clear, this was a survey of individuals' perceptions. We were not asking scientists and experts. We were asking people living in communities. And therefore, it's a sort of sense of the perceptions of whether individuals are affected by extreme weather events that we've been talking about, whether they feel prepared to this. And, the headline from that survey was 78% of the respondents of that 17,000 that we surveyed said that they'd been affected at least in a small part, but probably more moderate, majorly, by extreme weather events. And this is a growing trend throughout the world. So this survey was to understand what the experiences are and the lived experiences of people around the world and see how they perceive their community's preparedness to fight climate change, withstand climate events, and also what the perceived urgency is in different locations.
Who are these 17,000 people, Phil? How did you guys decide who you were going to ask?
So we used a combination of our existing survey data. So Gensler for years has had a deep base of survey data for our Workplace Experience Index and for our Canadian Workplace Experience Index here in Canada, where we survey, our clients, individuals in the communities that we're working with, and we try and do a good cross-section. So for example, in our group, we had I think it's 36% of individuals were millennials, 20% were baby boomers, 27-28% were Generation X. We try to get a good cross section of ages and economic income brackets within these 15 countries that we selected. The countries that we selected are also ones which we are active participants in terms of the built environment there. These are all locations where we have strong presence in the market and are practicing in those areas. So part of this is also to say, look, we're going to be designing projects in your cities. Let's hear from communities in that city how we can change our behavior and understand the perceptions of communities in which we practice.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the 78% number. People, 78% said that they were impacted. What else did you learn? What other really important pieces of information are we able to glean from that data?
Yeah, so I think there's a huge amount of data that we've synthesized in this. It's a publicly available report, so I can certainly furnish you the link. And if you'd like in your podcast to kind of circulate it to your listeners, we also found that we ask individuals how prepared they themselves felt to deal with climate change in terms of their cities and their communities, and also whether they thought that things were happening fast enough in their communities. So we heard that disruptions associated with power and with forest fires were, of critical importance in certain countries, but also the urgency was felt absolutely everywhere, right? So the urgency of this needs to be dealt with now. I think it was 65% of respondents said we need to be addressing this right now, with the remaining 25% saying within the next couple of years. Very few individuals said, yeah, let's kick the can down the road, which is one of the challenges with global climate change. It's urgent, but the effects are felt periodically, which is a challenge. But this survey helps hammer home that communities around the world are feeling the effects of this right now, and this is urgent. The preparedness bit is also really, it was a major insight and something that we're kind of distilling down and thinking about deeply now in terms of not only are people being affected by global climate change in their communities, and not only are they thinking we need to be making progress right now, they're also looking to the future and saying, we're not ready for this. We're not prepared for the changes that will happen. And these perceptions are important because these are the types of perceptions that drive people's decisions in their lives, where they decide to go to work, where they decide to live. If someone feels that they're not prepared for climate change and they're really worried about power outages in their area, they might look to move somewhere else. So these are the kind of insights to see where patterns are emerging and how we can help communities respond to these challenges more actively.
All right. Well, that's a great segue to my next question, Phil. How are you going to use that information at Gensler to drive resilience planning for cities?
So I think there are a number of different scales, and I'll start at the macro level for the cities level. I think, how we'd approach this is going to be a little bit different depending on which city we're talking about. I think some communities, a lot of provinces in Canada, a lot of cities in Canada are actually really tackling this head on. The British Columbia Wildfire Preparedness Agency is, leading the charge in terms of apps and information for communities in British Columbia and for the province. This is information that they know well. I think for cities that we're looking at that maybe are a little bit less prepared, when we build in these locations and we have interfaces with municipalities and cities, we can speak to this data saying, look, in your country, in your city, we're finding respondents are not feeling prepared. How can we help you address these questions at a sort of municipal level? Within communities, I think this same perception information could also be applied in community workshops and things like that. So a lot of the methodology of the questions that we asked could be applied for further research. So it becomes a useful tool for that. And at the building level, I think that this is where this is useful to communicate to actual clients and building owners and operators who, maybe are committed to ESG, maybe have sustainability goals, might have carbon emissions goals for their projects. A lot of clients that we work with, most of them do have that. But climate resilience, to think about what is going to happen in 50 years, what's going to happen in 10 years, is something that, this is a really good conversation starter to broach a topic that maybe isn't discussed quite so often as we get into the design of a project.
I have to ask a weird question. Have you had clients, after receiving this information, look you in the eye and say, I don't care. I just don't care. Just give me a beautiful but affordable building. Do you ever run into that?
So, I think it's a good question. I think there are some times where clients be like, why should I care about this right now? I'm building a project which its return on investment is in the next few years. Why are we thinking about 50 years? But there is a conversation to be had. And if we get that initial pushback, there's a follow-on discussion. Obviously, one of the things that Gensler is a market leader for, and one of the things we are most proud with, our relationship with our clients. And those relationships are honest and those are deep. And if for this one project the conversation manifests in a certain way, we'll have a follow-on session. We'll have a visioning session with them to see how there are values of that organization which might be put at risk if you don't consider these considerations of climate change more actively. We practice all around the world, and unfortunately we do have, locations around the world where climate change is yet to be a front and center topic that has gone beyond debate. There are ways to talk about comfort and health and well-being that doesn't necessarily have to talk about global climate change, but the principles are still there. So there are a number of ways we can approach it. It's a dialogue and depends on the client, but we always want to have that follow-up session if we initially get a little bit of concern from our clients.
Right on. Okay. I love the way you broke things down earlier where you talked about city level, neighborhood level, and then individual building level. Let's use that same sort of structure to talk about challenges.
Okay.
What are the biggest challenges for incorporating resilience into each of those levels?
So I think this is also an interesting and useful moment to talk about what does the integration of resilience look like at each of those scales? Because that will help your listeners understand what would be difficult to make that happen. So, at a city level and a sort of municipal policy level, there's an enormous amount that communities and cities can do in terms of changing their policies. And let's take one example to kind of go through that scale. Okay, let's look at extreme heat. Okay, so as I mentioned, urban heat island effect is a massive problem. And in areas where you have rising temperatures, urban heat island effect will make this much worse. And I think the stat that I recall is, I think it was in 2021, the number of health-related deaths associated with extreme heat in Quebec went up like 400% with at-risk communities. This is something which is like well and truly a dangerous proposition that cities need to tackle. A way in which we can help cities think about this is point to other examples where there are success stories, where chief heat officers are put in place, right? Where you can actually put in, individuals and task forces that specifically look at heat as an issue. And there are examples in the city of DC and elsewhere where they've mapped out where you have the highest temperatures, the lowest instances of green space and areas where you can cool yourself, and find areas in these hotspots, excuse the pun, and try at a strategic level, look at those communities and see what you do about this. The city of Toronto has policies as well in terms of extreme heat, and they have cooling spaces. So they've expanded this out. And I think in summer for extreme heat days, they extend the time that swimming pools are open, public swimming pools, to find areas where communities can access to cool down. So there's any number of sort of municipal policies that could be done at that level, but having a task force that's focused on that is a really good thing.
Do you know Alston Jakubiak? I have to interrupt you. I'm sorry, but do you know Alston at the University of Toronto?
That rings a bell. I don't know him personally, but I think I know of him. Yeah.
You should introduce yourself, or
Okay.
I'll introduce you to Alston. I mean, I know him because of his work with daylighting, but he's done a lot of work on urban heat effect.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and specifically his work, he looked at all the different mitigation factors, and the only one that really made a big difference was green space.
Yes.
Yeah, which I thought was really interesting and relevant to some of the work you're
Right.
doing.
Because exactly, and this is where we get down to the next level, which is the community level, because this is sort of the strategy of like, how do you approach this when you have to contend with 2 million people in extreme heat days that are increasing? How do you approach that at a strategic level? But when it comes to actual intervention of the community, yes, you got it, green space. This is about providing shaded tree areas to mitigate that heat hitting the ground and radiating back up, and also providing green space to absorb that heat in the ground through grass and bushes and whatever not, because that then provides shaded space so that you get, depending on the exact spatial condition of that street or neighborhood, you might get a 10, 15 degree temperature swing, might even be more between a unshaded, car heavy sidewalk and streets where the heat is just bouncing off everything, to then shaded sidewalks, which then provide shade not only to people walking the sidewalk, but also shade the cars. The cars aren't also heating back out. So at a community level, yeah, provide shade and also provide green space wherever possible is the kind of intervention. For buildings, I think this is where also you could think about designing your systems with passive technology so that then when you get solar gain on your facades, I know your podcast has talked about comfort and solar gain before. So this is something which has a direct correlation to comfort as well and climate resilience, because as the building heats up, the energy load increases, and this is obviously an issue. So those are 3 types of scale. And now we can talk about challenges if you want, because each of those have their own sort of unique challenges, I guess.
Well, let's go there a little bit. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Let's talk about what gets in the way.
I think that for cities, it's probably the fact that there are multiple simultaneous priorities that they have to contend with. We're all in Canada right now. I'm guessing a lot of your listeners here are here in Canada as well. If you look at the news and what's happening currently, and I don't want to go into a whole political debate, but I'm sure that cities and provinces have some very urgent economic priorities to be looking at in the light of tariffs and things like that, which unfortunately you have this dynamic of the urgent crowding out the important, right? And, a community that is really trying to have an honest look at what's going to happen in light of tariffs are, I don't know, our resilient future is going to be a priority in their spaces,
Right.
particularly because it's going to cost a bit. It's going to be setting up that agency and having that task force looking strategically at spaces is an investment, in that kind of shifting political will is a challenge at that sort of municipal level, particularly for communities who haven't started on that route, right?
Yep.
I kind of mentioned it before, but within actual communities themselves, I think one of the challenges is that if we use the extreme heat example, it's often communities at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder that are at most risk, that have the lowest propensity of having good green space, have the lowest risk of shaded spaces for people to be outside. And also older, less well-maintained buildings are more likely to not have adequate cooling, be it air conditioning or operable windows to bring in a bit of cool and fresh air into their spaces. So one of the challenges is the areas where you could do the most good might also have the most challenge in terms of, available funds or community organizing to make change, and are in neighborhoods that have other priorities as well.
I have to interrupt you again because you just triggered a question in my mind. Is there anything we can do? Are there steps that we can take that are inexpensive for economically challenged communities that can help?
So I think it is a struggle. I think there is, rather than just saying to solve for extreme heat by itself, can you do it cheaply? I think there's a way you can couch the conversation in terms of what are the additional synergistic knock-on benefits of addressing this question, and making a case that a moderate investment in improved green space, improved open space in a community is just about heat. You could go there, or you could say, in addition to that, you'll have better productivity from employees, you'll have better comfort, better safety, you'll have a higher quality of urban realm for communities, which intrinsically helps adding value to properties, adds value to homeowners. There's a way to talk about interventions in terms of resilient design that are not just about solving for climate change, but also there are multiple benefits to the urban realm associated with these. Most of the interventions that deal with global climate change in terms of resilience aren't they're not mutually exclusive to better cities. They help with that story, right?
Right.
Yeah. So
Well,
I
you
think
could probably,
that's a
if you
challenge.
dug into the data, you could probably find correlations with crime, right? And
Absolutely. Yeah.
right, you could probably find correlations with the cost of social safety nets as
Exactly.
well.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is kind of what I was getting at, which is if you make a case that interventions that are helping address global climate change and improving the resilience of communities also have knock-on socioeconomic effects to those communities outside of that. It's not just about risk mitigation anymore. It's about improving the quality of space and all of the associate benefits you get from that, right? So
Yeah. Oh,
yeah,
fantastic. Yeah.
yeah,
I love that. I love when it's not a trade-off.
100%. Yeah, because also, I mean, like, just to talk about the trade-off method, so often we get into conversations about what's the return on investment of, you know, X intervention versus Y, but I think there's a lot of the way I approach sustainable design is about if you make this intrinsic to what you're doing, then it is fundamentally you have this crossover synergy between a sustainable benefit and making a beautiful building, a sustainable benefit and health, a sustainable benefit and comfort. And therefore, the argument is less about what's your return on investment. It's more about this is fundamental to this project now, and this is how we're going to approach design in a passive, low impact, low carbon way that happens to be also beautiful and functional and does everything we need for the project and its community and its neighborhood.
Are there trade-offs between comfort, health, and designing for climate resilience?
Yeah, I was thinking about that because I know that health and comfort is the arc of this podcast. I was trying to think about if there's an instance. You know, I wonder whether, I mean, this is a marginal example, but I'll use it to illustrate that there may be in specific points where the design process might need to challenge this. So, fresh air and operable windows for the right type of building in the right climate zone is wonderful. And natural ventilation is something that when I was practicing in Europe is something we talked about all the time because natural ventilation is intrinsically a healthy way to be in a passive design ethos.
Mhm.
If you're in an environment which has a lot of forest fires and you have a lot of that smoke that we were talking about, there's a trade-off then, which if you're relying on ventilating through operable windows for a majority of your time, you have both a challenge with the smoke, but also then you don't have a filtration mechanism which is as elevated as it possibly could be. That's a marginal example, but I think for your listeners and for you, Joe, I think that broadly speaking, resilient design and passive design solutions are fairly linked. I think there's a lot of crossover and a lot of overlap to that. And I think that it's important to note that things when it comes to heat and severe weather events and things like that, improving the resilience of the building ensures that it is comfortable, ensures that it is healthy for those instances of acute change, which are going to be happening anyway. So it helps you improve the health of the building when things are bad. Right?
You mentioned beauty. Is there any sort of trade-offs with, diminishing beauty in order
Yeah.
to achieve a more resilient building? I can't think of any myself. I was just
Yeah.
curious if that's come up in any of your projects or if that conversation is being had.
So I think that if you approach solving for climate change in a sort of a tactical way, that we have this one risk we have to solve for, and then you don't think holistically about how you do it, there are instances where, I don't know, levees and dikes to deal with storm surges, if not designed appropriately, A, risk failing, and B, can also kind of negatively impact a city's interface with the coast, right? You're in Atlantic Canada, like having a
Mhm.
big seawall there, there's a limit to how good that can be. However, there
Right.
are plenty of examples of passive landscape solutions to absorb storm surge water, which look a little bit different from a traditional seawall, for example, that if you done well, then for the majority of the time are these beautiful sort of mangrove forests or seafront spaces which then absorb that storm water, that storm surge in a way that then is more sensitive. Now, actual sea level rises, there's a challenge there, but that's an example of if you approach this in a sort of holistic design sense, you can find really innovative solutions that don't necessarily become technical solves to, passive design questions. Right?
In one of the very early shows that I did here, I had Dr. Blaine Brownell from the University of North Carolina on the show, and he introduced me to this idea of, what did he call it? Conspicuous green.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So historically, over the last 30 or 40 years, we've designed buildings the way we've always designed buildings, but then we added, a more efficient HVAC system on the roof, right? So the green was hidden. And he talked about the idea of designing the buildings so that it's obvious that there's passive cooling, it's obvious that there's passive heating, whatever particular technique you're using, make it obvious and simultaneously make it beautiful. Have you run into that sort of concept? And
Oh, absolutely. Like, I think the principles of biophilia are principles we apply to our projects all the time. Even if it's an interior project, what are the principles of biophilia and the resultant health and productivity benefits that biophilia comes into projects? Yeah, this is like, table stakes for us. We definitely apply those principles. And the idea of communicating the environmental and passive design qualities of a space explicitly rather than just improving efficiency, I think is super valuable because it talks about this is a healthy space and the associated benefits to that. There's a ton of research in terms of use to the outdoors and connection with nature improves health and well-being, so let's champion that. For some of the climate resilient aspects we need to be thinking about in terms of like storm surges or hurricanes, there are instances where you will need some technical solutions. There are some instances where like for forest fires and buildings, improved filters are just the way to go, and there's a way that you don't necessarily talk about that in the overall design of the building with a capital D. But I think that a project will be much more successful if health, sustainability, climate resilience, and connection to nature are all considered holistically. And that's how you get the best buildings out there. That's where you get these integrated, beautiful solutions. It's not just here are a series of problems to solve for. It's that integrated design approach, which is absolutely critical to success. Otherwise, someone's going to try and, I don't know, save costs or reduce that out. And then you're going to have a project that's almost there, but not quite, right?
I've also had the good fortune of having Lisa Heschong on the show, and she talked about the error of the singular focus on any particular aspect of building design. And if you become singularly focused, then you run the potential of creating damage in other aspects of the design. So that's really critical.
It's really important. I think the more I'm thinking about this, that there are other aspects. We kind of went deep into like sort of extreme heat and cities and all those scales. I think it would be useful for your listeners to also know that there are instances where a strategic solution might actually be technical. And I'll give an example of when you get extreme weather events of like extreme cold or extreme heat that puts the electrical grid at risk, right? Where you have a few years ago in Texas, like the grid basically failed, and you had communities that had not experienced extreme cold not having heating. It was a huge, huge disaster, right? Billions of dollars of impact. And, how do we make communities and buildings more resilient to changing shift patterns in temperature and weather, which will have an impact to the grid? So one question is making the grid more resilient, for sure, but then also for buildings and for communities, looking at microgrids and backup energy generation through battery storage to then make sure that critical operations happen. On-site renewables also help with that a little bit as well, right? If the grid is going to struggle during an extreme weather event, a little bit of on-site renewable power can help you keep the lights on and keep critical operations going. So I want to make sure that whilst we're kind of talking about beauty and health and comfort in the context of resilience, there are also some technical solutions which are important to know about, particularly in terms of energy resiliency as well, right?
Do you want to bring lots of healthy, beautiful natural light in your building and still meet energy codes? Try Solera from Advanced Glazings. Learn more at advancedglazings.com. Yeah, I love it. All right. You led into my $1 million question very beautifully just a moment ago. And it's the question I ask every single guest, Phil, and you can answer it from whatever perspective you'd like. I'm pretty sure I can guess which one.
This is exciting.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I can guess which your perspective you're going to come from. But what makes a great building?
Oh, gosh. How long we got?
Much time as you want.
I think that I led in at the beginning of our session today with the idea of impacting positively the communities and the users in the cities that I kind of experienced and grew up with. And I still feel that's first and foremost, right? If you're not doing a net good to the community in which you're building, be it through the users of those buildings, the spaces, doesn't matter how the scale, right? It could be a small office, it could be a repositioning of a lobby. Like if you're not actually making a positive good with the work that you're doing as an architect practicing, what are you doing, right? Like this needs to be fundamentally what that is. How you get there in terms of low impact design, low carbon design, reuse of the materials, being kind of, I would say, respectful to the stuff that you're putting into a project, because the constituent materials you're putting into a project will be around longer than that project, are all principles that create an approach to design that is intrinsically considered and rigorous, and those constraints and those parameters will distill down the essential nature of what you're trying to achieve, in a way that if you had a carte blanche and did whatever you want and you focused on just form, okay, fine, you maybe get a nice form, but what else is going on there? So I think there's an essentialism to that rigor of low impact design and careful design. And part of that has to be passive design, right? Daylight and health and comfort and healthy spaces for the communities and for the occupants of those spaces, so all of that ties together into sort of one big narrative. There's also this notion that, doing as little as possible with the biggest impact is also a principle that I really love. Okay. And this is sort of part of, that sort of essentialism, that rigor to apply to a design process, right? So we often work with our clients to look at what are their programming needs, or repositioning buildings. We've been leading the charge in terms of the office to residential market, helping clients who have assets saying, okay, what are we doing? You could knock down this building, or you could also reuse it. And that kind of doing only what's needed to make the most impact and to really respond to what your client and what the community needs is part of that sort of rigor and that essentialism that I hold as part of what makes a great building. That was a very long answer, but there's a bunch to that. You're asking an architect what makes a great building. That's a tough one.
It was a great answer. It was a terrific answer, Phil. Don't worry about the length. You covered some really important aspects there, so I hugely appreciate it. Look, before we sign off, Phil, do you have any exciting news or anything that you'd like to promote and share with our audience?
Yeah, no, I mean, for sure. So we've touched on it throughout this podcast, and we've been talking about resilient design and sustainable design, and I think it's important for your listeners to know that in addition to climate resiliency, our climate mitigation design, i.e. what communities would normally think of as like sustainable design, is something that we're super committed to. So Gensler has committed to, by the end of the decade, so 2030, removing the net emissions from our projects. This is a massive, lofty goal, and we're approaching it through our Gensler Cities Climate Challenge. Within that, we're leading the industry when it comes to the specification of materials with our Gensler product sustainability standards. We have another publication we've released recently called the Climate Action Through Design publication, which accounts for our energy and our carbon in our projects. This is something that we're doing around the world. So I think our commitment to sustainable design is not just about withstanding the effects of global climate change, but also being really proactive in reducing the impacts of the projects we are working on up front. I'll use the Gensler Product Sustainability Standards as an example. And this is a publicly available series of requirements for now 20 materials that we are specifying in our projects with minimum performance standards in not just carbon, but health, VOCs, supply chain, and material transparency. So this is something that we're using not only to change our projects, but also to create a feedback loop with the industry so that we encourage suppliers and manufacturers to improve themselves. Because I think you have lots of different design firms saying, oh, we care about sustainability. That's great, but how? What are the requirements? And being super clear about that is the only way you're going to get actual suppliers to change their actual supply chain and their actual manufacturing. So I wanted to use that as an example of the types of things that Gensler does in our practice outside of just the climate resiliency discussion we've been having today, which I've loved. It's been wonderful, but I want to say there's a whole bunch of other things that Gensler does that maybe I'll come back another time. We can talk about that.
Let's do that for real. Let's schedule another episode for sure.
Okay.
Phil, thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. I can't thank you enough for being here.
It's been great, Joe. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Better Buildings for Humans. For more information on the world's best light diffusing and highly insulating glass glazing, please visit advancedglazings.com.